Session 76 covers named credentials, the Salesforce feature that moves external service URLs and authentication out of Apex code and into setup. If you currently have API keys, bearer tokens, or base64 encoded credentials anywhere in an Apex class, this session will show you how to remove them entirely. The problem named credentials solve is common. An integration gets built. The developer hardcodes the base URL and constructs the authentication header in Apex. It works. Then a second developer builds another callout to the same service and copies the pattern. 6 months later, there are 5 Apex classes that all reference the same external service, each constructing the auth header slightly differently. When the API key rotates, someone has to find and update all 5, write updated test classes, and deploy to every environment. Named credentials eliminate this pattern. A named credential is a Salesforce metadata record that stores 2 things: the base URL of the external service and the authentication configuration for connecting to it. When Apex makes a callout using a named credential, Salesforce resolves the base URL, builds the full endpoint, and injects the authentication header automatically. None of this is visible in the Apex class. The syntax change in Apex is minimal. Instead of a hard-coded URL or a custom setting lookup, the endpoint becomes callout, credential name /path. Salesforce sees the callout prefix, finds the named credential with that name, replaces it with the stored base URL, appends the path, and constructs the full URL. At the same time, Salesforce reads the authentication configuration and appends the appropriate header, a bearer token, a basic auth header, an AWS signature, without any code involvement. Here is the code pattern. HTTP request is created. The endpoint uses the callout prefix with the credential name. The method is set, and the request is sent. That is 4 lines for a complete authenticated callout. There is no auth header construction, no token retrieval from a custom object, no base64 encoding. The authentication is invisible to the Apex code. To create a named credential, go to Setup, search for named credentials, click New. You provide a label, a name. This is what appears after callout. In your Apex code, the base URL of the external service, the identity type, and the authentication protocol. The name field is what your code references. Choose something descriptive and stable, because changing it later requires updating every callout that references it. 2 of the simpler authentication types are no authentication and basic authentication. No authentication stores only the endpoint URL, useful for public APIs, IP-restricted services, or APIs where the key is passed as a URL parameter. Basic authentication stores a username and password. Salesforce encodes them as username, password in base64 and sends the authorization, basic header automatically. No encoding code in Apex. OAuth 2.0 is where named credentials become most powerful. For the client credentials flow, used for machine-to-machine integrations, you configure the OAuth app's client ID, client secret, and token endpoint URL in the named credential. Salesforce requests the access token from the token endpoint, stores it, injects it as a bearer token on every callout, and refreshes it automatically when it expires. You write 0 token management code. The token never appears in Apex. JWT token authentication lets Salesforce construct and sign a JSON web token using a private key you configure in setup. The signed JWT is injected as the authorization header. AWS Signature v4 handles the complex header construction required for AWS services. The 4-part HMAC, SHA 256 signature, the canonical request format, the signed headers list, all generated by Salesforce from your configured AWS access key and secret. In both cases, the cryptographic operations that would otherwise be dozens of lines of Apex are replaced by a setup configuration. The identity type field on a named credential determines whether all Salesforce users share one credential or each user has their own. Named principal means a single shared credential for the entire org. Every callout from any user, any batch job, any scheduled class uses the same URL, the same token, the same external identity. This is appropriate for service-to-service integrations where the identity of the individual Salesforce user is irrelevant to the external system. Per user means each Salesforce user authenticates individually. When a user triggers a callout through a button, a screen flow, an LWC action, Salesforce uses that user's personal token for the callout. The user must have completed the OAuth flow at least once, which they do through the authentication settings for external systems section in their user settings. Per-user credentials are not suitable for automated contexts like batch Apex, scheduled Apex, or future methods. Those run as system user contexts, not as a specific Salesforce user, so there is no personal token to use. Starting in winter 23, Salesforce introduced external credentials to separate authentication from endpoint configuration. The previous model put both in one named credential record. The new model uses two records, an external credential that stores the authentication configuration, and a named credential that stores the endpoint URL and references an external credential. The Apex syntax is identical, callout, credential name/path, but the setup structure is different. The two-record model enables per-user authentication to work properly at scale. When a user connects to an external service, their token is stored against their user records association with the external credential. Multiple named credentials can reference the same external credential. So if you have 3 API endpoints that all use the same OAuth app, you create one external credential and 3 named credentials, each with its own endpoint URL, but all sharing the same auth configuration. The difference in Apex code before and after adopting named credentials is dramatic. Before, you retrieve a config record from a custom setting, build the endpoint URL by concatenating the stored base URL with the path, construct the authorization header by prepending bearer to the stored token. After, you set the endpoint using the callout prefix. The auth header construction disappears entirely. The token is no longer in the custom setting or the database. It is managed by Salesforce. When should you use named credentials versus custom settings or custom metadata for external service configuration? Use named credentials when authentication is involved, when you need to manage tokens, passwords, or signing keys. Use custom metadata for configuration values that are not credentials, feature flags, thresholds, category mappings, label strings. The distinction is whether the value is a secret. Secrets belong in named credentials. Non-sensitive configuration belongs in custom metadata. One operational detail. When Salesforce resolves a named credential in a callout, the domain of that named credential's URL is automatically added to the remote site settings allow list when the named credential is created. You do not need to separately manage remote site settings for endpoints accessed through named credentials. For callouts made to raw hard-coded URLs, you do still need to manually add the domain in remote site settings. This difference is a common source of confusion when debugging a new callout that fails immediately. Named credentials support merge fields in certain configuration fields, allowing you to pass runtime context to the external service. For example, you can configure a custom request header that passes the Salesforce user's email address using the merge field notation. The value is evaluated at callout time from the current transaction context. This is useful for external APIs that need user identity information without implementing per-user OAuth. You pass the user's identifier as a header while still using a shared credential for authentication. Named credentials are Salesforce metadata and deploy through standard deployment tools, change sets, SFDX, metadata API. The metadata type is named credential. However, there is an important behavior to know. When you include a named credential in a deployment package, the credential values, the base URL, the client secret, the API token, are excluded from the package. The metadata structure deploys, but the values do not travel. After deploying to each environment, an admin must open the named credential and set up and configure the values for that environment. This is the expected security behavior, not a gap. Testing Apex callouts that use named credentials works identically to testing any other callout. Implement the HTTP callout mock interface with a respond method that constructs and returns an HTTP response. Register the mock with test.setMock before the test code executes. When the Apex code under test calls http.send, the framework intercepts the call and routes it to the mock's respond method instead of attempting to contact the external service or resolve the named credential. The mock does not need to know whether the endpoint uses a named credential or a raw URL. It intercepts all outbound callouts unconditionally. Session 76 is complete. The topics covered: what named credentials are and why they exist, the callout, endpoint prefix pattern in Apex, creating named credentials and setup, authentication protocols including NoAuth, basic, OAuth 2.0 with automatic token management, JWT, and AWS SIG v4, identity type, named principal versus per user, external credentials, and the two-record model, deployment behavior, and why credential values require manual post-deployment configuration and testing with HTTP callout mock. The full article is at realsyllabus.com. Session 77 next. Platform events. Introduction for Salesforce developers.